Hey, what's up everyone? I'm glad you've tuned into our KE at Home together. Today we're going to do a review of the whole David series that we've done over the term. Some of it was done in Kids Extreme, but most of it has been done while we've been in lockdown. Thanks to everyone who has contributed to this lesson. So our David series was split into 3 parts. So our first part was as David as the unknown king. And the 3 stories that we looked at before David was made king were done while we were in KE. Remember those days? Seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? So David is anointed. This was our introduction to David. He was the youngest son of Jesse, living in Bethlehem, just a young shepherd boy. God tells the prophet Samuel to anoint David as the next king of Israel because he sees in David something that pleases him. He sees David's heart. This is our verse from that story.
One Samuel 16 verse 7. The Lord does not look at the things people look at.
People look at the outward appearance. But the Lord looks at the heart.
One Samuel 16 verse 7. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart.
Our second story is David is victorious. When all the soldiers of Israel were afraid of Goliath, the Philistine giant, David went up against him, knowing that the battle belonged to the Lord. He trusted in God and killed Goliath with just a sling and a stone. The verse given to the Giant Slayers group at the beginning of the year was taken from this story as David faced Goliath.
You come against me with a sword, a spear, a javelin, but I come against you with the name Lord Almighty, the God of armies of Israel. Samuel 17 verse 45.
Our third story, David is in danger. King Saul was bothered by an evil spirit, so David was brought to the palace to play the harp for him. We saw how Saul had become moody, unhappy, angry, and also afraid and jealous of David. He tries to kill him twice. So David flees from the palace and hides in the caves. It was during this time that he wrote Psalm 57. This is the psalm that I sent out to you. David trusted God to keep his promises. Our second part of the series was called Living God's Way. As David waited to become king, we saw how he continued to trust God and live God's way by choosing to do what was right, even though he was in danger. We read about David and Jonathan being loyal friends and choosing to honour and love each other and not be jealous of what the other had or could have. And we thought about what makes us a good friend. We read how David chose to forgive Saul and not take revenge by killing him, even though he had 2 opportunities. Forgiving someone who has hurt us is not always easy, but it is God's way. Here is the verse taken from this story.
The Lord rewards people who are faithful and live right.
1 Samuel 26 verse 23.
Our third part was about David as God's chosen king. Here we see God's faithfulness in the fulfillment of the promise that David would be king. After experiencing God's faithfulness, David is faithful to a promise he made to his friend Jonathan. He locates his son Mephibosheth and takes care of him and includes him in his own house. After making Jerusalem the capital of all Israel, David wants to show that God is important and that worshipping him should be a priority. David brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is made a place of worship. David plans to build a house for God to put the covenant box in, but God had a better plan. David's son would build the temple, but from David's family line would come a king that would reign forever. His name is Jesus. Our next verse is from one of the many psalms of praise that David has written.
I will give thanks to you, Lord, with all my heart. I will tell of all your wonderful deeds. Psalms 9 verse 1.
Our final story was about when David sinned and how he repented before God. And we talked about how repent means to do an about turn. So to start living another way, not just saying sorry and carrying on living the same way. This was seen in Psalm 51, which David wrote. In this psalm, he acknowledged that he had done wrong and deserved God's judgment, but truly wanted to make a new start. God forgave David, but he still had to live with the consequences of his sin, like we all do. So that wraps up our David series. I hope you've enjoyed learning and hearing about it together in your families while you've been at home. So now I've got a few questions. I wonder, what has been your favourite story from our David series? What is one thing you have learnt about David? And what have you learnt from David that helps you? Here's what some people have shared.
Hey Abigail, I have some questions for you. Do you think you can answer them for me?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so what's your favourite story from our David series?
My favourite story from our David series is 1 Samuel chapter 17, which is David and Goliath.
No way, that's my favourite story too. Okay, so, well, what have you learnt about David?
I have learned that David did not use armor, a sword, or a spear. All he did was have faith and trust in God.
That is so cool. And one last question for you. What have you learnt from David that helps you?
I have learned that David, even if you are struggling, no matter how big the problem is, God is always beside you. So all we need to do is just have faith in Him.
Thank you.
One of our favourite stories about David is when King Saul and his army were hunting David in the desert.
One night, David and his cousin Abishai crept past all the sleeping soldiers and into King Saul's tent. Abishai wanted to kill Saul, but David wanted to wait for God to work it out, and all he did was take Saul's spear and water jug. Just like Nathan Bennett said on the KE Facebook page, David trusted God and showed forgiveness, not revenge.
David had a close relationship with God. He knew God's will. He listened and obeyed God. David showed grace, not revenge, towards King Saul because he trusted God's timing for when God wanted him to be king over Israel. David trusted God for his safety. This story is a good reminder to me to keep a close relationship with God, to trust Him and to show kindness to others.
Another lesson from this story is that sometimes we need to be wise and know the difference between forgiveness and trust. Saul said, "Come back, David. I will not try to harm you again." But David knew from past experience that he could not trust Saul. We read that Saul returned home, but David went to another country. I also have to laugh at the amusing bit in the middle, where David stood on top of a hill and yelled out to the captain of Saul's army, "Hey Abner, aren't you meant to be a man? But you did not look after your master, the king."
I have no one favourite David story. I learned what sins David did. One of them was when he saw this lady out his palace and told one of his people to bring her to his palace. He liked her and wanted to marry her. So he put her husband at the front of the army where the strongest soldiers went. So he was killed, and David married her. A prophet came and told David a story. David knew he had sinned. The stories of David taught me that God will always be with me and anyone else who believes with God.
My favorite part was when David won the battle over Goliath, because a young boy winning a battle over a man who has trained for so long is encouraging. One thing I've learned from David was that David was brave and courageous, and he had trust and faith in God to stand up to Goliath. What I have learned from David that helps me is that it doesn't matter how small I am or what challenges I will face. As long as I have God by my side, everything will be okay.
What is your favourite story from the David series?
My favourite story from the David series is when David spared Saul's life.
What is one thing you've learned about David?
One thing I've learned is that he didn't disobey God and take revenge when he could have.
What have you learned from David that helps you?
I've learned that we should always forgive and choose to do the right thing, and also God keeps his promises.
My favorite story of David was when he battled Goliath, because he knew that the Lord was with him in his darkest times. Something that I learned about David was he never gave up and he had a fighting spirit, knowing that the Lord was by his side. I learned from David that I always should put my trust in God no matter how big or small the situation is.